I want to start with something that most people do not know about property law because most people never need to know it until someone makes them need to know it. A survey marker is not a suggestion. It is not an estimate. It is not a general indication of approximately where one property ends and another begins. It is a precise legal boundary established by a licensed land surveyor, recorded with the county, and backed by the full weight of property law in every jurisdiction in this country. When a survey marker says your property line runs here, it runs here, not 6 inches to the left, not a foot to the right, here, exactly here, to the inch. I know this now with the kind of intimacy that only comes from having to use the knowledge in a real situation. Before that situation, I knew it the way most people know it, abstractly, theoretically, in the way you know things that have never been tested against the real world. My name is Calvin Marsh. I am 44 years old. I have owned the house on Ridgecrest Drive for 6 years, and for 5 years and 10 months of those 6 years, I was what I would describe as an unremarkable homeowner in the best possible sense of that phrase. I paid my HOA dues. I maintained my lawn to the required standard. I repainted my shutters when the HOA sent a courtesy notice about fadding. I showed up to the annual meeting once, sat in the back, listened to a budget discussion that took 40 minutes longer than it needed to, and went home. I was not involved. I was not engaged. I was a homeowner on a residential street who wanted to live his life and be left alone to do it. The HOA had other ideas. Not the HOA as a whole, I want to be precise about that. The HOA as an organization was mostly functional. The problem was a specific subcommittee that had been formed 18 months before the situation I am going to describe, called the Community Enhancement and Property Standards Committee, which existed in theory to coordinate neighborhood improvement projects and in practice had become the personal domain of a woman named Rhonda Tillies. Rhonda had been on Ridgecrest Drive for 12 years. She had been on the HOA board for 4 of those years in various capacities and had served as the chair of the Enhancement Committee since its formation. She was the kind of person who brought a level of organizational energy to neighborhood governance that would have been genuinely valuable if it had been paired with any meaningful interest in what other people thought. She ran the Enhancement Committee like a project manager running a development firm, with timelines and deliverables and a standing agenda that moved fast enough that residents who attended the meetings sometimes left without being entirely sure what had been decided. I had no direct conflict with Rhonda before the fence. We had spoken perhaps 6 times in 6 years, mostly at HOA functions, and the interactions had been pleasant enough in the surface way of people who do not know each other well and have no reason to be anything other than polite. I had no opinion of her beyond a vague awareness that she was very organized and moved very fast in meetings. The fence changed everything. The project was announced in a community newsletter that Rhonda distributed by email in early spring. It was described as a Community Perimeter Enhancement Initiative, which was the Enhancement Committee's formal name for what was, in practical terms, a plan to install a new wooden privacy fence along the rear boundary of the HOA common area that abutted the backyards of 7 properties on the south side of Ridgecrest Drive. The common area was a narrow strip of maintained grass that ran behind those 7 properties, used occasionally for walking and connecting to the small community park at the east end of the street. The fence, according to the newsletter, would define the boundary between the common area and the adjacent private properties, create a cleaner visual line, reduce encroachment from neighboring lots, and enhance the overall aesthetic of the rear corridor. The project had been budgeted from the Enhancement Committee's discretionary fund and approved in a meeting I had not attended. The newsletter included a diagram, a simple line drawing showing the proposed fence line running along what was described as the rear HOA boundary. I looked at the diagram. I noted that my property was one of the 7 affected. I noted the proposed fence line. I filed the newsletter in the back of my mind without much concern because the diagram showed the fence running along the far edge of the common area, not near my yard. I was not looking carefully enough at the diagram. That was my first mistake. Construction began 6 weeks later. A crew arrived on a Monday morning, and I watched from my back window as they began marking posts along the rear of the common area. I went to work. I came home. The first posts were in the ground. I looked at them from my back fence. They seemed far away. I went inside. By Thursday, the fence was going up. I came home Thursday evening and stood at my back fence and looked at the new structure taking shape and felt the first small wrongness that I did not yet have a name for, something about the line of it, something about the angle. The fence was not running parallel to the far edge of the common area the way the diagram had suggested. It was angling, gradually, subtly, but angling, in my direction. I went inside. I found the newsletter. I found the diagram. I looked at it more carefully this time. The diagram was not to scale. I will say that again because it matters. The diagram in the community newsletter that had been distributed to all 7 affected property owners showing the proposed fence line was not drawn to scale. The proportions were approximate, and the approximate proportions had concealed, whether deliberately or through carelessness, I did not yet know, the fact that the proposed fence line was not running along the far edge of the common area as I had understood. It was running along a line that, from what I could observe, was significantly closer to my property line than any reasonable reading of the diagram had suggested. I went back outside. I stood at my rear fence. I looked at the new fence posts from there. Then I went inside and found my property documents. I had a copy of my survey from when I bought the house. I had a copy of the plat map. I had the legal description of my property with metes and bounds. I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at these documents, and I looked at what I could observe from my back window, and I thought about what I was seeing. Then I called a licensed land surveyor. The surveyor, a man named David Tran, who ran a small firm and had been recommended to me by a colleague, came out the following Saturday. He was precise and efficient and spoke very little beyond what was necessary for his work. He set up his equipment, established his reference points from the existing survey markers at the front corners of my property, and ran his measurements to the rear. He finished in about 90 minutes. He came and found me in the backyard where I had been watching the process with growing attention. He said, "Mr. Marsh, I need to show you something." He showed me on his equipment display. He showed me the legal boundary of my property at the rear. He showed me where the new fence posts had been installed. The fence was on my property. Not at my property line, not adjacent to it, on it. The fence, as currently being constructed, was running between 14 and 22 inches inside my legal property boundary at various points along its length. The entirety of the planned fence structure was being built on land that belonged to me. I stood there and looked at David Tran's equipment and the numbers on his display for a long time without saying anything. David waited. He was the kind of professional who understood that people needed a moment with certain kinds of information. I said, "You're certain?" He said, "I am certain. I can prepare a formal survey report with documentation if you need it." I said, "I need it." He said, "I'll have it to you by Wednesday." I looked at the new fence posts in my backyard, standing in my soil, attached to nothing yet because the fence boards had not been installed on this section, just posts in the ground, my ground. I said, "What would it take to establish the correct line visually?" He pulled survey flags from his bag. He walked the boundary and placed a flag at each point where the fence posts crossed inside my legal property line. 7 flags. 7 points where construction was happening on land that did not belong to the HOA, that had never belonged to the HOA, that was mine according to every legal document in existence. I thanked David. He packed his equipment and left. I stood in my backyard, surrounded by the survey flags and the new fence posts, and a feeling I did not have a single clean word for, which was the particular combination of violated and vindicated that comes when you discover something wrong has been done to you and you have discovered it before it has been completed. I did not call Rhonda that day. I did not call the HOA board. I did not go to any neighbor. I went inside and I thought very carefully and very slowly about what I had, what I needed, and what I was going to do with both. What I had was a licensed surveyor in the process of preparing a formal report documenting that the HOA's construction project was encroaching on my private property by 14 to 22 inches along the entire rear fence line. I had survey flags on the ground showing exactly where the encroachment was occurring. I had my original survey documents. I had the HOA newsletter with the misleading diagram. I had the fact that construction was ongoing and not yet complete. What I needed was that formal survey report, a clear understanding of my legal options, and a conversation with a property attorney before I took any action that could be characterized as reactive. I called Rebecca Park, the same property attorney whose number I had gotten from a colleague the previous year when I had a completely different and minor issue that had ultimately resolved itself. Rebecca said she could see me Tuesday. I said I would be there. I spent Saturday evening and Sunday reading everything I could find about property encroachment law in my state. Easements, adverse possession, encroachment rights, the legal remedies available to a property owner when a third party constructs a structure on their land. I had no legal training, but I was thorough and I took notes, and by Sunday evening I had a working understanding of the relevant concepts. The key concept was this: if a structure is built on your land without your permission, you have the right to require its removal, not a negotiation about it, not a discussion about what is practical or convenient, a legal right to require removal. The burden is not on you to accommodate the encroachment. The burden is on the party who built on your land to fix the situation. I also found something that I had not initially known to look for: a concept regarding access. If the HOA's common area was designed to be accessed through or along a corridor that passed near my property line, and if the construction of the fence on my land created a physical structure that then required anyone accessing my property or the common area to interact with something that was legally mine, there were implications for that. Property owners have the right to control access to their own land. The right to grant or deny easements, the right to determine what sits on their property and what does not. I wrote all of this down. I put it in a folder with the survey flags and the newsletter and my original documents. I went to bed. Monday, the construction crew came back. I watched from my kitchen window as they began installing fence boards. On my property, I watched them work for 15 minutes. Then I went out and told them I was a property owner with a dispute regarding the fence location and that I was in the process of consulting an attorney and that I wanted them to be aware of the situation. The crew foreman was a man named Lewis who had the practical patience of someone who had been dealing with homeowners in the middle of projects for many years. He said, "Sir, we're contracted by the HOA. Any concerns about the project need to go through them." I said I understood. I said I wanted to document that I had notified the crew of the dispute so that continued construction was proceeding with awareness of the issue. I took a photograph of Lewis and the fence and the survey flags that were still in the ground behind him. Lewis looked at the survey flags. He looked at me. He said, "Those flags yours?" I said yes. I said they marked my property boundary. He looked at the flags again. He looked at the fence posts. He looked at the distance between them. He said, "Hold on a minute." He got on his phone. He had a conversation I could not hear in full. When he finished, he said, "We're going to pause on this section for today. I need to check something with the project contact." I said I appreciated that. I went back inside. I updated my notes. I called David Tran and confirmed the formal report was still on track for Wednesday. He said yes. Tuesday, I went to see Rebecca. Rebecca Park had the office of someone who handled a significant volume of work and had optimized for function over impression. Files everywhere, organized but present, the desk of someone who was actually in the middle of things rather than staging for meetings. She listened to the full situation with her elbows on the desk and her hands folded and her attention complete. When I finished, she said, "The survey flags are still in place." I said yes. She said, "Construction has paused on that section." I said yes, as of Monday. She said, "And the formal report comes Wednesday." I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Calvin, what outcome do you want here?" I said I want the fence moved to the correct location. I want the HOA to acknowledge the encroachment. And I want something in place that prevents this from happening again, meaning any future enhancement committee project that comes near my property line goes through a process that involves a survey before a shovel goes in the ground. She said all of those are reasonable and achievable. The first one is legally mandatory once you formally assert your property rights. The second and third require some negotiation, but you're holding enough to get them. I said, what am I holding? She said, you're holding a licensed survey documenting unauthorized construction on your land. You're holding the fact that construction continued after you notified the crew of the dispute. You're holding a misleading diagram in a community newsletter that affected 7 property owners, not just you. And depending on the specifics, you may be holding something else. I said, what else? She said, tell me about the common area access. How does the HOA normally access the rear of those 7 properties, meaning the common area strip? I described the layout. The common area ran behind the 7 south side properties. Access to that common area from the main street was through a path at the east end near the community park, and at the west end through a narrow opening between the last property on that side and the adjacent street. There was no third access point. Rebecca said, and where exactly is your property in the sequence of 7? I said, third from the west end. She said, so to access the western portion of the common area from the main access point, you have to pass alongside your rear boundary. I said, yes. She said, and the fence they're building, which is currently sitting on your property, runs along that access corridor. I said, yes. She was quiet again. Then she said, Calvin, do you know what a permissive use agreement is? I said I had read about it, but wanted her explanation. She said, when a third party regularly uses or accesses a portion of your property, even unintentionally, even as part of a long-standing practice, the property owner has the right to formalize or withdraw that use. The HOA has presumably been accessing that rear corridor for years. That access runs along your property line. If any portion of that access corridor overlaps your legal boundary, you have the right to require a formal easement agreement for that access. Without one, you can, within certain limits, restrict it. I looked at her, I said, can I restrict access to my property? She said, it depends on the specifics. Let me see the survey when it comes Wednesday. I said, Rebecca, what are you thinking? She said, I'm thinking that the HOA has built a fence on your land, which gives you leverage. And that leverage is most useful if you understand the full scope of what you're holding before you start the formal process. I said, how long do we wait? She said, Wednesday, after the survey report, then we send the letter. I went home. I spent Tuesday evening in my backyard looking at the survey flags and the paused fence construction and thinking about access corridors and easement agreements and the specific weight of a licensed survey report. I also thought about the other 6 property owners on the south side of Ridgecrest Drive. If the fence line was encroaching on my property, was it encroaching on theirs? I did not know, but I thought it was worth finding out. I sent a carefully worded message through the neighborhood communication system to the other 6 affected homeowners. I said I had retained a licensed surveyor in connection with the fence project and had some findings I thought might be relevant to them. I said I would share the survey report once I had it and invited anyone interested to be in touch. 4 of the 6 responded by Wednesday morning. Survey report arrived Wednesday afternoon. David Tran had prepared it with the thoroughness of a professional who understood it might become a legal document. It documented, with precise measurements and coordinates, the encroachment at each point along the fence line as it currently stood, 14 to 22 inches on my property. The report included photographs of the survey flags, the fence posts, and the measuring equipment. It was signed, dated, and prepared on his firm's official letterhead. I read it twice. I sent it to Rebecca. I sent it to the 4 neighbors who had responded. Within 2 hours, 2 of those neighbors had called me. One of them, a man named Frank Osai 3 houses down, said his own survey markers had always suggested the fence line was closer to his property than seemed right, but he had not pursued it. He said he thought he might have a similar issue and was willing to have David Tran look at his boundary. The other call was from a woman named Sarah Chen, who was the third house in from the East End. She was quieter than Frank, but more direct. She said, "Calvin, what are you planning to do?" I said I was working with a property attorney and was in the process of formally asserting my property rights regarding the encroachment. She said, "If the fence is on my property too, can I join what you're doing?" I said, "Let's get your survey done first. David Tran can come Saturday." She said, "I'll call him today." I went to see Rebecca Wednesday evening with the report in hand. She read it thoroughly. She looked at the site photographs. She looked at the measurements. She said, "This is clean documentation. This is exactly what we need." I said, "What about the access corridor question?" She said, "The survey report confirms what I thought. The rear access path, the one the HOA maintenance crew uses to access the western end of the common area, runs within your legal boundary at 2 points. Not significantly, but measurably. Meaning any use of that path by HOA personnel or contractors involves, at 2 points, crossing your private property." I sat with that. I said, "Without an easement." She said, "Without any formal agreement of any kind." I said, "So they have been crossing my property for 6 years." She said, "And now they have also built a fence on your property." I said, "What does the letter say?" She said, "The letter demands removal of the encroaching fence sections within 30 days, formal acknowledgement of the encroachment in writing, a survey-based survey of the full fence line before any resumed construction, and the initiation of a formal easement agreement process for the rear access corridor." I said, "And if they don't agree to the easement process?" She said, "Then the access question becomes its own matter, which I think you already understand." I said, "If they don't agree to formalize the access, I can restrict it." She said, "Within legal limits. You cannot block an established access route without following proper process. But you can make it very clear that the access they have been using is not a right. It is a courtesy that is currently under review, and that the review is contingent on how they handle the primary encroachment issue." I said, "Send the letter." She said, "It goes out tomorrow." I drove home. I stood in my backyard in the evening quiet and looked at the survey flags and the paused fence and the rear of my property where the common area access path ran along the line that was mine. 2 points where HOA personnel had been crossing my land for 6 years. One fence currently sitting 14 to 22 inches inside my boundary. 6 years of an unremarkable homeowner on Ridgecrest Drive. The fence had been their first mistake. The access corridor was going to be the thing that made them understand why mistakes about property lines have consequences. End of part 1. Part 2. HOA built a fence on my property, so I legally blocked their backyard access. The letter went out Thursday morning. Rebecca sent its certified mail to the HOA board chair, a man named Dennis Albright, who I had met twice and found to be a reasonable and somewhat overwhelmed volunteer administrator dealing with an enhancement committee that moved faster than he could keep up with. She also sent a copy to the enhancement committee directly, meaning to Rhonda Tilley's. And she sent a copy to the HOA's registered attorney, a firm named Whittaker and Associates that handled legal matters for several HOA organizations in the area. The letter was 4 pages. It documented the encroachment with reference to David Tran's survey report. It cited the relevant property law statutes. It made the 4 demands I had outlined with Rebecca. And at the end, in a paragraph I had asked her to include specifically, it noted that a preliminary review of property access patterns in the rear corridor had identified potential unformalized use of private property, and that this matter would be addressed as a secondary concern once the primary encroachment issue was resolved to the satisfaction of the property owner. That paragraph was deliberate. It did not make a specific threat. It did not claim a specific right. It simply put on record that I was aware of the access situation and that it was something I intended to address. Rebecca said language like that had a specific effect on attorneys and HOA boards because it signaled that the person sending the letter had done their homework and was operating with more information than the other side might have assumed. She was right about the effect. Dennis Albright called me Friday morning at 8:15. He had clearly read the letter the evening before and had spent the night thinking about it. He was the kind of person who becomes more careful under pressure rather than more combative, which I appreciated. He said, "Calvin, I want to be honest with you. I was not aware of the survey issue before this letter." I said, "I know." He said the enhancement committee submitted the project with the standard documentation package, and I approved it without an independent survey. I should have required one. I said, "Yes." He said, "I am not defending that. I am just trying to be transparent about how we got here." I said, "I appreciate the transparency. What I need to know is whether the board is prepared to address the 4 items in the letter." He said, "I convened an emergency board session last night by conference call. The board is in agreement that the encroachment has to be corrected. We are suspending the construction project immediately pending a new survey." I said, "Good, the other items." He paused. He said, "The written acknowledgement is being prepared by our attorney. The easement process is the item that needs more discussion. I want to be honest about that too. It is more complex and there are multiple parties involved." I said, "I know it is complex. That is why the letter asks for initiation of the process, not immediate completion of it." He said, "That is a distinction I appreciate." I said, "Dennis, what I need you to understand is that I am not looking for a fight. I am looking for the right process to be followed from this point forward. The fence needs to move. The access needs to be formalized. If the HOA engages with those things in good faith, I will engage in good faith." He said, "And if not?" I said, "Then I will follow whatever legal process is appropriate, and that process will be more expensive and more complicated for everyone involved than the alternative." He said, "I understand. I will be in touch by Monday with a formal response to each item." I said, "I'll look for your communication." He said, "Calvin, one more thing. Rhonda Tillies is going to want to talk to you directly." I said, "Rhonda can talk to Rebecca Park." Pause. He said, "I'll let her know." Rhonda did not contact Rebecca. She contacted me. Saturday morning, knock on my front door. I answered it to find her standing on my porch with her notepad in her hand and the expression of a person who was accustomed to managing conversations from a position of authority and had arrived intending to do that. I want to give her credit for one thing. She did not pretend the situation was other than it was. She said, "Calvin, I want to talk about the fence and the survey." I said, "Rhonda, I have an attorney handling this matter. Any communication regarding the fence dispute should go through her." She said, "I'm not here in an official capacity. I'm here neighbor to neighbor." I said, "The distinction doesn't change my answer. Rebecca Park is my representative in this matter. Her number is in the letter." She said, "I wanted to explain how the measurement error occurred." I said, "I don't need an explanation right now. I need the 4 things in the letter." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "The fence was a mistake." I said, "I know." She said, "We didn't intend to encroach on your property." I said, "I believe that. Intent doesn't change the legal situation." She said, "What do you want, Calvin?" I said, "The 4 things in the letter." She said, "The easement process is going to take time and involve the full board." I said, "I know. That is why the letter asks for initiation of the process." She said, "And in the meantime?" I said, "In the meantime, I would ask that access to the rear corridor be routed through the east end access point only, which does not cross my property, until a formal agreement is in place regarding the 2 crossing points on my boundary." She looked at me carefully. She said, "That would require the maintenance crew to go the long way around." I said, yes, it would. She said, that is significantly inconvenient. I said, Rhonda, you built a fence on my property. Long pause, she said, the East End access only. I said, until the easement process is complete. She said, I will communicate that to the maintenance crew. I said, I would appreciate that in writing through Rebecca. She nodded once, she left. I closed the door. I called Rebecca immediately and relayed the conversation. She said, she agreed to the access restriction. I said, she agreed to route through the East End only. Rebecca said, Calvin, that is a significant concession. She has effectively acknowledged that the access through your boundary points is something that requires your permission. I said, I know. She said, when she puts it in writing, that acknowledgement is going to be extremely useful in the easement process. I said, that is why I asked for it in writing. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you have thought about this very carefully. I said, I had a lot of time between Saturday and Wednesday. She said, I'll be watching for the written communication. The written confirmation from the HOA came Monday as Dennis had promised. It addressed each of the 4 items in the letter. Fence removal and relocation to the correct survey boundary was confirmed, with a 30-day timeline and a commitment to use David Tran's survey as the reference. Written acknowledgement of the encroachment was included, signed by Dennis as board chair and by the HOA attorney. The new survey requirement before any resumed construction was confirmed. And the easement process initiation was acknowledged, with a proposed timeline of 60 days to begin formal discussions. A separate addendum, signed by Rhonda on Enhancement Committee letterhead, confirmed that rear corridor maintenance access would be routed through the East End access point pending resolution of the property boundary question. It used the specific language I had requested, pending resolution of the property boundary question, which meant the restriction was formally tied to the easement process and could not simply be declared over whenever it became inconvenient. I read all of it twice. I sent it to Rebecca. She called me within the hour. She said, this is a complete response. They have accepted every item. I said, is it binding? She said, the written acknowledgement and the maintenance access addendum are both signed documents. The easement process commitment is a board resolution. Yes, it is binding in the sense that they have put everything in writing and attached their names to it. If they deviate from any of it, you have documentation. I said, what about the other homeowners, Frank and Sarah? Rebecca said, that is the next question. Do you want to pursue this collectively? I said, I think the others deserve the same process I've gotten. If the fence line is wrong on my property, it may be wrong on theirs. She said, if multiple property owners are asserting encroachment claims simultaneously, the HOA's position becomes significantly more difficult to manage. I said, I know. She said, are you prepared to coordinate that? I said, I'm prepared to share what I've learned and let each person decide what they want to do. I'm not looking to organize a campaign. I'm looking to make sure the right process is available to anyone who needs it. She said, that is a careful distinction. I said, I've been trying to make careful distinctions throughout this. She said, you've done well at it. Saturday of the following week, David Tran surveyed Frank Osai's rear boundary and Sarah Chen's rear boundary on the same day. Both of them were there for their own surveys. I was not present by design. This was their property and their process, and my involvement was limited to having connected them with David and shared the relevant documents. David's reports came Tuesday of the following week. Frank's fence line was encroaching by 8 to 11 inches. Sarah's was encroaching by 11 to 17 inches. 3 of 7 affected properties with documented encroachments. The other 4 had not pursued surveys yet. I sent a message to all 4 through the neighborhood communication system, the same message I had sent before, attaching David's reports for my property, Frank's, and Sarah's. I said that if they wished to have their own boundaries reviewed, David Tran was available and had the context of the project already established. 2 more came back with surveys within the week. Both showed encroachment. 5 of 7 properties. I sent that information to Rebecca. She was quiet for a longer time than usual on the phone. Then she said, "Calvin, 5 of 7. I said, "Yes." She said, "The HOA did not survey any of these boundaries before starting construction." I said, "Apparently not." She said, "The Enhancement Committee proposed a perimeter fence project. The board approved it, and nobody checked where the legal perimeter actually was." I said, "That appears to be what happened." Rebecca said, "This is not a minor administrative error. This is a pattern of unauthorized construction on multiple private properties. The implications for the HOA's liability here are significant." I said, "I know." She said, "What do the other 4 property owners want to do?" I said, "Frank wants to send his own letter. Sarah wants to coordinate with me. The other 2 are still deciding." She said, "Calvin, I want to recommend something. A joint letter. 5 property owners, 1 attorney, 1 demand. It sends a clearer message about the scope of the situation, and it creates more significant pressure for a comprehensive settlement." I said, "What kind of settlement?" She said, "Fence relocation for all 5 affected properties. Written acknowledgement for all 5. A formal policy requiring independent survey verification for any future Enhancement Committee project within 100 feet of a private boundary, and a community communication about what happened that accurately describes the encroachment rather than letting the HOA manage the narrative." I said, "The community communication is the one Rhonda is going to fight hardest." Rebecca said, "Yes, because it takes the story out of her control." I said, "Is it achievable?" She said, "With 5 property owners aligned, yes. The HOA is not going to want this to become a public dispute that goes beyond the community newsletter." I said, "Let me talk to the others." The conversations with Frank and Sarah and the 2 other affected owners, a couple named the Brewsters at the far east end, took the better part of a week. Frank was direct and decisive. Sarah was thoughtful and asked careful questions. The Brewsters consulted their own attorney first and then came back aligned. By the end of the week, all 4 had agreed to the joint letter approach. Rebecca prepared the joint letter. It was 6 pages, and it was the clearest piece of legal writing I had read in the course of this situation. It laid out the 5 encroachments with survey documentation for each. It calculated the combined encroachment area in square feet. It cited the statutory framework for unauthorized construction on private property. It made the demands Rebecca and I had discussed. And it included a timeline of 30 days for initial response and 60 days for comprehensive resolution. It went out on a Thursday morning to Dennis Albright, the HOA attorney at Whitaker and Associates, and Rhonda Tillies. Rhonda called me Thursday afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail said she wanted to discuss the letter and hoped we could find a reasonable resolution without things becoming more complicated than necessary. Her voice had a quality I had not heard in our previous interactions, something that was not quite controlled. I forwarded the voicemail to Rebecca. I did not call back. Dennis called Friday morning. He was more composed than I expected. He said, "Calvin, I am going to be honest with you. This letter has changed the scope of the situation significantly." I said, "I know." He said, "The board convened last night. We have agreed that the comprehensive approach you are requesting is the only viable path forward." I said, "All 5 items." He said, "All 5 items. The community communication is the most difficult one politically. I want to be honest about that. There are board members who feel strongly about how that is framed." I said, "The framing is not something I'm negotiating. The communication needs to accurately describe what happened. It does not need to be punitive. It does not need to single out individuals, but it needs to be accurate." Dennis said, "Can I send you a draft?" I said, "Send it to Rebecca. She will review it with me." He said, "Calvin, I want to say something. The way you have handled this, the documentation, the survey, working through proper channels, it has made this much more straightforward than it could have been. I appreciate that." I said, Dennis, I didn't want a fight. I wanted my property respected. If the HOA had come to us before construction and done the surveys, none of this would have been necessary. He said, I know, that process change is going to happen. I said, I know it is. It is in the letter. He almost laughed. He said he would be in touch. The resolution took 8 weeks from the joint letter to the final signed agreement. 8 weeks of back and forth between Rebecca and the HOA attorney, of draft documents and revised drafts, of small negotiations about language and timeline and process. I was present for all of it in the sense of reviewing everything and providing input, but Rebecca handled the actual negotiation with the skill of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly where to hold firm and where flexibility cost nothing important. The final agreement covered all 5 items. Fence relocation for all 5 affected properties, with surveys completed before any construction, using David Tran as the agreed reference surveyor. Individual written acknowledgements for all 5 property owners. A formal enhancement committee policy requiring independent survey verification for any project within 150 feet of a private property boundary. And a community communication that was honest about what had happened without being inflammatory. The community communication went out in the HOA newsletter 6 weeks after the agreement was signed. It was 2 paragraphs. The first described the fence project, acknowledged that construction had been initiated without adequate survey verification, confirmed that the fence had encroached on multiple private properties, and outlined the corrections that had been made. The second described the new survey verification policy. It did not name Rhonda. It did not name the enhancement committee by name. It was accurate without being punitive, which was what I had asked for. I read it when it arrived in my email. I read it twice. Then I put my laptop down and went to the backyard. The fence was gone, not just the sections that had been on my property. The entire project had been paused and then restarted from scratch with correct survey boundaries. The new fence line ran where it was supposed to run, along the actual legal boundary of the HOA common area, which in my case was more than a foot further away than the original construction had been. The difference was visible if you knew what you were looking at. Not dramatic, just correct. The rear access corridor ran where it had always run, along the back of the common area. The formal easement agreement for the 2 crossing points on my property was signed and recorded with the county. The access was legitimate now, formal, documented, mine to agree to because I had agreed to it, not theirs to use because they had always used it. Frank Osai came over that evening with a 6-pack of beer. He said, "It's done." I said, "It's done." He said, "You know, Rhonda resigned from the enhancement committee." I said I had heard that, not from official sources, just through the neighborhood communication network that operates in the background of any residential community. He said, "Do you feel bad about that?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, I don't think I caused it. I think the situation caused it. What I did was document what happened and follow the right process. The consequences for the people responsible for what happened are not mine to manage." He said, "That's a reasonable way to look at it." I said, "The new survey policy is what matters. That's the structural fix. Everything else is just the situation working itself out." He said, "Structural fix." He looked at me. He said, "You actually think like that?" I said, "I think about what breaks things and what holds them together. I think about load over time." He said, "You've been thinking about this whole thing that way?" I said, "Since the survey flags went in the ground." He opened 2 beers. He handed me one. We sat in my backyard as the evening came on over Ridgecrest Drive, the common area behind us correctly fenced at last, the light going warm and long across the grass. He said, "What would you have done if they hadn't responded to the letters?" I said, "Taken them to court." He said, "You would have done it." I said, "Frank, they built a fence on my property." He nodded slowly. He drank his beer. He said, "You're a very calm person to be very serious." I said, "Those 2 things go well together." He said, "Yes, they do." We sat until it was dark. Sarah Chen texted both of us at some point during the evening to say she had walked the new fence line and it looked right. Frank showed me the text. We both looked at it and then looked at the fence and then looked at our beers. It was a good evening, the kind that earns its quietness. I want to close with the thing I said to Dennis Albright early in the process that I think turned out to be true. I said I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for the right process to be followed. That is the honest summary of everything that happened on Ridgecrest Drive over those months. The HOA made a mistake that was large in its implications, but probably small in its intention. Nobody woke up and decided to build on my land. They just moved too fast, without the verification step that would have caught the error before it became a problem. And by the time I found out about it, there was a fence on my property and 7 other homeowners who might have the same problem. The right process was a survey. The right process was a formal letter. The right process was documentation and attorneys and signed agreements and a policy change so the same mistake could not happen again. None of that required anger. All of it required patience and precision and the willingness to hold firm when the other side tested whether you meant what the letter said. I meant what the letter said. I always meant what the letter said. The backyard looks good now. The fence line is correct. The common area is maintained by people who use a formalized access agreement to cross the 2 points on my boundary, a small thing that most people would not notice, but that represents the difference between a courtesy that can be withdrawn and a right that has been granted. David Tran's survey report is in my files. Rebecca Park's number is in my phone. The HOA newsletter with the 2 paragraphs about what happened and what changed is in a folder in my home office. I am still an unremarkable homeowner on Ridgecrest Drive. I pay my dues. I maintain my lawn. I go to the annual meeting occasionally and sit in the back and listen to the budget discussion run long. But I know exactly where my property line is.